The year is 1878. In the blood-red dust of the Arizona Territory, a land of saints and savages, a desperate woman's life is about to be stolen, not by the unforgiving sun or the rattlesnake's bite, but by a man. This isn't a story of rescue. It's a story of capture. You think you know the Wild West. You know nothing. Forget tales of heroic cowboys. Prepare for the true, brutal story of Emma. A woman whose daily fight for survival ends when an Apache warrior looks at her not with pity, but with possession, and decides she is his. The sun was a merciless god in the Arizona Territory, and Emma Hayes was its most scorned disciple. Each morning it rose with a painter's cruel flourish, splashing violent hues of orange and pink across the vast, indifferent sky, before settling into a flat, white heat that baked the very soul. It was 1878, and for the 2 years since her husband Thomas had coughed his last dusty breath, Emma's world had shrunk to the size of a 5-gallon bucket. Her life was a litany of back-breaking labors, but none was more constant, more essential than the hauling of water. The San Pedro River, a vein of life in a dying land, was a brutal 2-mile walk from her crumbling adobe shack. 2 miles there, 2 miles back. Every single day. The path was not a path, but a memory of one etched into the hard pan by her own weary feet. It snaked through shola and prickly pear past skeletal mesquite trees that clawed at the sky, their branches like the arthritic fingers of old men. Emma was 26 but looked 40. Her skin, once the color of fresh cream, was now a tapestry of sunspots and fine lines stretched taut over high cheekbones. Her hands were her husband's hands, now calloused and cracked, the nails permanently rimmed with dirt. Her hair, a sun-bleached tumble of straw, was perpetually escaping its tight bun, sticking to her sweaty brow in damp tendrils. Only her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held any remnant of the girl she'd been, a girl who had believed in the promise of the West, in the sweet lies Thomas had whispered of prosperity and a land of their own. That promise had turned to dust, just like Thomas. Consumption, the doctor in Tucson had called it. A city sickness that had followed them into the wilderness and claimed him in their tiny, suffocating shack, leaving Emma with nothing but his debts, his ghost, and the crushing weight of survival. This morning was no different. The yoke, a crudely fashioned piece of pine Thomas had made, dug into the bones of her shoulders. It was designed to distribute the weight of the 2 buckets. But after the first mile, it felt less like a tool and more like a punishment, a constant reminder of her solitary burden. The empty buckets banged against her legs, a hollow, mocking rhythm that echoed the emptiness in her belly. She passed the Jacobsons' homestead, a more prosperous-looking outfit, with a proper well and a windmill that spun lazily in the faint breeze. Martha Jacobson was often out tending her chickens, a plump woman, with a perpetually disapproving frown. She saw Emma and her buckets, and sniffed a small, sharp sound of pity mixed with contempt. To the Jacobsons and the few other settlers, scratching a living from the unforgiving soil, Emma was a cautionary tale. The widow Hayes, the poor woman, a ghost haunting the edges of their hard-won respectability. Emma kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, on the shimmering heat that distorted the distant mountains. She didn't need Martha's pity. Pity didn't fill buckets. It didn't mend a leaky roof or keep the fire going on cold desert nights. Work was all she had. Work was her prayer, her penance, her reason for drawing one more ragged breath. The final stretch to the river was the worst, a steep, rocky decline, where a single misstep could send her tumbling. Her ankles, scarred from previous falls, ached in protest. The air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and cottonwood trees, a scent so intoxicating it was almost painful. And then she saw it. The river. It wasn't much, just a sluggish brown ribbon of water. But to Emma, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. She filled the buckets, her arms trembling with the effort. The initial weight was always a shock, a sudden violent pull that threatened to tear her shoulders from their sockets. She rested for a moment, splashing the cool water on her face, the brief respite, a fleeting moment of grace. Then she settled the yoke back onto her shoulders and began the long, agonizing journey back. It was on the return trip that she felt it. A prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She froze her heart, a frantic bird in her ribs. The desert was a place of hidden dangers, mountain lions, javelinas, rattlesnakes, and men. Men were the most dangerous of all. Prospectors, outlaws, drunkards from the saloons in Tucson. A lone woman was a target, a piece of meat left out in the sun. She scanned the landscape, her eyes darting from rock to bush. Nothing. Just the vast, silent emptiness. The sun beat down the silence, amplifying her fear. She told herself she was imagining it. The heat played tricks on the mind. The solitude was making her jumpy. She took another step, the water sloshing in the buckets, the sound deafening in the stillness. And then she saw him. He was so still he might have been carved from the red rock itself. He sat astride a pinto pony on a low bluff overlooking the path not 50 yards away. An Apache. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the heat. The settlers spoke of the Apache in hushed, terrified whispers. Savages. Ghosts of the desert. They moved without a sound, their raids swift and brutal. They were the reason men kept loaded rifles by their doors, and women feared to stray too far from home. This one was lean and powerful, his bare torso, the color of burnished copper, crisscrossed with old scars. A single feather was tied in his long black hair, which fell loose around his shoulders. He wore buckskin leggings and moccasins. A rifle lay across his lap, but it was the knife at his hip that held Emma's gaze. It looked brutally functional. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. He wasn't looking at her the way the men in Tucson looked at her with their leering smiles and hungry eyes. This was different, colder, more analytical. It was the look of a predator studying its prey. Emma's mind raced. Should she run? Scream the Jacobsons were too far away to hear, and running with the heavy buckets was impossible. If she dropped them, she would have to come back. The thought of facing this journey again was almost as terrifying as the man on the bluff. So she did the only thing she could. She lifted her chin, stared straight ahead, and walked. Each step was an act of defiance, a silent scream against the fear that threatened to paralyze her. She could feel his eyes on her, a physical weight on her back. She focused on the rhythm of her steps, the creak of the yoke, the slosh of the water, one foot in front of the other. That was all there was. She didn't dare look at him again. She just walked her back straight, her heart hammering against her ribs. She walked until the bluff was behind her, until she could no longer feel his gaze. Only then did she allow herself a small, shuddering breath. She made it back to the shack, her body screaming in protest, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. She half expected him to be there waiting for her, but the shack was empty just as she had left it. She poured the precious water into the large barrel by the door, her hands shaking so badly she spilled some. That night she barricaded the door with her only chair and sat in the dark, clutching the rusty axe Thomas had used for chopping wood. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. Every gust of wind, every scuttling sound of a desert creature sent a fresh wave of terror through her. The Apache had not harmed her. He had not moved, not spoken, but his presence had shattered the fragile peace of her solitude. He had reminded her that she was not just poor, not just a widow. She was vulnerable. A single spark in a world of predators, and the wind was picking up. The weight of the water was nothing compared to the new weight she now carried. The weight of fear. The days that followed were a torment of sun and silence. The Apache was always there. He never approached her. He never spoke. He simply appeared, a silent sentinel on the landscape, as inevitable as the rising sun. Sometimes he was on the same bluff, a stark silhouette against the morning sky. Other times he was further away, a distant figure on a ridge, or half hidden in the shade of a Palo Verde tree. But he was always watching. His presence became a part of her daily trial, another hardship to be endured like the heat and the thirst. At first it was pure terror. Her journey for water became a gauntlet of fear. Her eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, searching for his familiar form. The 2 miles to the river felt like 100. The 2 miles back were an exercise in controlled panic. But as the days bled into a week, a strange, unsettling shift began to occur. The terror did not recede, but it was joined by something else, a bewildering sense of routine. He was a feature of the landscape now, like a particular saguaro or a uniquely shaped rock. His silent observation became a bizarre, unnerving constant in her life of unending variables. She began to notice things about him. The way he sat on his pony with a stillness that was both relaxed and coiled, ready for action. The pinto pony itself, a beautiful animal with a black and white coat, was as still and patient as its master. He carried a bow and a quiver of arrows on his back, in addition to the rifle. He was a warrior, a hunter. What did he want with her? The question gnawed at her, a constant, low-grade fever in her mind. Was he waiting for the right moment to attack? Was he studying her routine, her weaknesses, or was this some kind of cruel psychological game, a way to terrorize the lone white woman until she fled or went mad? The other settlers remained oblivious. Emma didn't dare tell anyone. What would she say? That a man was watching her from a distance. They would either dismiss her as a hysterical female, or worse, form a posse and go after him. The thought of the violence that would unleash the bloodshed that would inevitably follow terrified her, almost as much as the Apache himself. An Apache warrior, killed by settlers, would bring the wrath of his entire tribe down on them all. Their small, fragile community would be wiped out. So she kept her silence, the secret a burning coal in her throat. One afternoon, the monotony of her fear was shattered by a new, more immediate threat. She was on the return journey, the sun at its zenith, the buckets at their heaviest. She was halfway home when 2 men on horseback appeared on the path ahead of her. They were not from the settlement. They were rough-looking men, with sun-scorched faces and mean, squinting eyes. Prospectors, most likely, their dreams of gold, having long soured into a bitter resentment of the world. "Well, looky here, Jeb," the first one said, his voice a gravelly drawl. He had a greasy beard and tobacco-stained teeth. "Looks like we found ourselves a little desert flower." The other one, Jeb, a lanky man with a cruel twist to his mouth, licked his lips. A mighty thirsty flower by the looks of it. Carrying all that water. Must be for her man. "Don't see no man." The first one said, his eyes roaming over Emma's body with a raw, possessive hunger. Just a pretty little thing all by her lonesome. Emma's blood ran cold. She had dealt with men like this in Tucson, their casual lewdness, their assumption that a woman alone was a woman available. But here in the vast emptiness of the desert, there was no one to appeal, to no sheriff to call. There was only her and them. She stopped the yoke, cutting deep into her shoulders. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Let me pass." Jeb laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, we'll let you pass, darling. But first we might require a small toll, a little bit of hospitality for two weary travelers." He started to dismount, his intentions sickeningly clear. Panic seized Emma. She thought of the axe back at the shack. She thought of the 2 miles of empty land between her and safety. She was trapped. She opened her mouth to scream, though she knew it was useless, and then a shadow fell over them. Both men froze their heads, snapping up. Emma followed their gaze. The Apache was there. He was no longer on a distant bluff. He was on the path, not 20 feet behind her, his pinto pony silent as a ghost. He must have followed her using the terrain for cover. How long had he been there? Had he seen the whole thing? He had his rifle in his hands, now held loosely, but with an air of absolute competence. His face was a mask of cold fury. He didn't look at Emma. His dark eyes were fixed on the 2 prospectors, and in their depths was a look of such chilling menace that Emma felt a tremor of fear for them. "What the hell?" The bearded man stammered, his hand inching towards the pistol at his hip. The Apache spoke. His voice was low, guttural, a sound like stones grinding together. He spoke in his own tongue, a short, sharp burst of words. Emma didn't understand them, but the meaning was unmistakable. It was a command, a warning, an ultimatum. Jeb, the lanky one, seemed to recover his bluster. "We ain't afraid of no redskin," he sneered, though his voice trembled. "There's 2 of us, and 1 of him." The Apache's response was not verbal. With a movement so swift it was almost a blur, he raised the rifle to his shoulder. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion, just a cold, deadly purpose. He didn't aim at the men. He aimed at a large cholla cactus about 10 feet to their right. The crack of the rifle shot echoed through the canyon, a sharp, violent sound that made Emma jump and the prospectors' horses rear in terror. A chunk of the cactus exploded in a shower of spines and green flesh. It was a display of marksmanship that was as terrifying as it was impressive. The message was clear. The next shot would not be a warning. The 2 men stared, their faces pale under their grime. The bravado drained out of them, replaced by a primal animal fear. They had stumbled into a situation they didn't understand. A confrontation with a man who was not just a savage, but a warrior in his own element defending his territory. Or defending her. The bearded man slowly raised his hands, his eyes wide. All right. No trouble. We're just moving on." Jeb, still trembling, scrambled back onto his horse. They didn't spare Emma another glance. They spurred their horses and galloped away their dust trail, a testament to their haste. Emma stood rooted to the spot, her body shaking uncontrollably. The buckets felt impossibly heavy, now the water sloshing over the rims and soaking her dusty skirt. The silence that descended was more profound than before, broken only by her own ragged breathing. She finally turned to face him, to thank him, to question him. She didn't know. The words died in her throat. He was looking at her now. The cold fury was gone from his eyes, replaced by that same intense, unreadable scrutiny. He lowered his rifle and nudged his pony forward, closing the distance between them until he was just a few feet away. She had to crane her neck to look up at him. He was taller than she had realized, his presence overwhelming. He stared at her for a long, silent moment. He looked at the yoke on her shoulders, at the heavy buckets at her cracked and calloused hands. His gaze lingered on her face, on her sun-scorched skin, and her frightened, stormy eyes. She expected him to turn and leave, to melt back into the desert as silently as he had appeared. But he didn't. He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful. He walked towards her, and for a terrifying second, she thought he was going to harm her after all. She flinched, taking a step back. He stopped. He held up a hand, not in a threatening way, but as if to calm a frightened animal. Then he reached out, not to her, but to the yoke on her shoulders. With a strength that seemed effortless, he lifted the entire apparatus, the wooden beam, the heavy water-filled buckets off her shoulders, and set it gently on the ground. The sudden release from the weight was so profound that Emma staggered, her knees buckling. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Her shoulders, her back, her entire body screamed in protest and relief. He stood before her, his shadow falling over her, shielding her from the brutal sun. He was so close, she could smell the scent of horse and leather and the faint, dusty aroma of the desert itself. He raised a hand and with a single finger gently brushed a strand of sweat-soaked hair from her forehead. His touch was surprisingly light, almost tender. It was the first human touch she had felt in a very, very long time. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time she saw something beyond the warrior, beyond the predator. She saw a flicker of something. It wasn't pity. It wasn't lust. It was something far more complex, something ancient and resolute. Then he spoke. His voice was still low and guttural, but the harsh edge was gone. He spoke in broken, heavily accented English, the words clearly learned and practiced. No more, he said, his voice a deep rumble. No more water. He gestured to the buckets, then to her. "You are done," he stated. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration. And then he delivered the final life-altering blow, the words that would shatter her world and remake it in an image she could never have conceived. "You are my wife now." The Apache camp was not a place. It was a living, breathing entity nestled in a hidden canyon where the rock bled crimson and the sky was a relentless, infinite blue. To Emma, it was a cage, a beautiful, terrifying cage. The warrior's name was Nakai. It meant, "he who wanders," a name she would come to understand in the marrow of her bones. He had led her there, not with ropes or threats, but with an implacable will that allowed for no argument. He had simply picked up one of her water buckets, gestured for her to follow, and started walking. And Emma, in a state of shock so profound, it felt like a dream had followed. What choice did she have? To refuse was to be left alone in the desert. Her protector, now her captor. The two were, she was beginning to realize, terrifyingly indistinct. Life in the Apache camp, the rancheria as they called it, was a brutal awakening. Her former life of hardship had been a pale imitation of this. This was a life stripped to its essence, survival. The Apache lived in wickiups, simple dome-shaped structures made of bent branches and covered with brush or hides. They were temporary, mobile, a testament to a people who were one with the shifting sands of the desert. Nakai led her to his wickiup. It was larger than the others, and inside it was surprisingly clean and organized. Furs and blankets were neatly piled, and a small fire pit sat in the center. But it was not empty. A woman was there, grinding corn on a stone metat. She was younger than Emma, perhaps 18, with a round, pretty face and eyes as black and shiny as obsidian. She looked up as they entered, her gaze flicking from Nakai to Emma, and her expression curdled into one of venomous hatred. This was Taza Nakai's first wife. The confrontation was immediate and silent. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Taza's eyes raked over Emma, taking in her pale skin, her foreign clothes, her obvious terror. It was a look of pure, undiluted loathing. This was her home, her husband, her life, and Emma was an intruder, a contamination. Nakai spoke to Taza in their fluid, clicking language. His tone was firm, brooking no argument. Taza responded, her voice sharp and angry. Emma stood feeling like a stray dog brought into a home unwanted and utterly out of place. The argument was short. Nakai's authority was absolute. He turned and left the wiki up, leaving Emma alone with her new rival. The first few weeks were a living hell. Taza made her life a misery. She was given the most menial, back-breaking tasks. She scraped hides until her hands were raw and bleeding, the stench of the animal clinging to her for days. She gathered firewood under the searing sun, her arms scratched and torn by thorns. She was tasked with grinding endless amounts of corn, a repetitive, soul-crushing labor that made hauling water feel like a vacation. She was an outcast. The other women of the tribe followed Taza's lead, ignoring her or staring at her with open hostility. They called her Inda, the white woman, the enemy. The children bolder would sometimes throw small stones at her or shout insults they had learned from their parents. Emma retreated into herself, a ghost in a vibrant, violent world. She learned to be invisible, to keep her head down, to speak only when spoken to, which was never. She ate alone the meager portions of rabbit stew or corn mush that Taza deigned to give her. She slept on a thin blanket in the corner of the wiki-up, as far from Nakai and Taza as she could get, listening to their muffled movements and the alien sounds of their language in the darkness. Nakai was a paradox, a man of brutal contradictions. He was the architect of her misery, her captor. Yet he was also her only shield. He never laid a hand on her in anger. When he saw that Taza was giving her no food, he would hunt a rabbit or a bird himself and cook it over the fire, handing her a piece without a word. When he noticed her shoes were falling apart, he left a new pair of soft buckskin moccasins by her sleeping mat. They fit perfectly. He was always watching. Their nights were a tense, unspoken negotiation. He would lie on his side of the wiki-up with Taza, and Emma would feign sleep, her body rigid with fear and anticipation. He had called her his wife. He had claimed her. But he did not touch her, not in the way a husband touches a wife. It was a strange, unsettling form of mercy that she didn't understand. It made her feel less like a wife and more like a possession, an object he had acquired and was now deciding what to do with. One day, a new, more profound level of her personal hell was revealed. A raiding party returned to the camp, whooping and celebrating. They brought with them horses, rifles, and whiskey, looted from a freight wagon they had ambushed. They also brought a scalp, a fresh one. It was long and blonde, the color of corn silk, the color of Emma's hair. The warriors drank the whiskey and danced around a great bonfire, their painted faces demonic in the flickering light. They reenacted the raid, their movements savage and exultant. And Emma watched her heart, a stone in her chest, as one of the warriors paraded the blonde scalp, the firelight catching the golden strands. This was the reality of the people she was living with. They were not just hunters and survivors. They were killers. They had killed men who looked like her, who spoke her language. They had killed perhaps men like Thomas. The thought made her physically ill. She fled the fire, stumbling into the darkness, her stomach heaving. She fell to her knees, gasping for air, the sounds of the celebration ringing in her ears. A hand fell on her shoulder. She cried out, scrambling backwards. It was Nakai. He had followed her. His face was unpainted, his expression grim. The firelight cast long shadows across his chiseled features. "They are celebrating a victory," he said, his English still broken, but his meaning clear. "They are honoring the spirits." Victory. She choked out the word, tasting like ash in her mouth. "You call that victory? Murdering people, stealing that thing." She couldn't bring herself to say the word. Nakai's expression hardened. "Your people come and steal our land. They kill the buffalo. They poison our water. They bring the coughing sickness that kills our children. They want to put us on reservations and watch us die. That is murder. We fight to survive. We fight for our home." He crouched in front of her, his presence intense, demanding. "You see a scalp. I see the face of my brother, killed by the blue coats. I see my sister who died of the sickness your people brought. You see savages. We see warriors." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She had lived in her own small world of suffering her own private grief. She had never considered the other side. She had seen the Apache as a faceless, monolithic threat, the stuff of nightmares and cautionary tales. She had never seen them as people with brothers and sisters, with their own grief, their own reasons to hate. It didn't excuse the brutality. It didn't make the blonde scalp any less horrifying. But it cracked open a door in her mind, a door to a perspective she had never imagined. She looked at him, really looked at him not as her captor, but as a man defending his world just as she had been trying to defend hers. Why, she whispered the question that had been haunting her for weeks. "Why me? Why did you take me?" Nakai was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. He reached out, and for the second time, he touched her. He gently took her hand, turning it over to look at the palm. It was still red and raw from scraping hides. He traced the calluses with his thumb. "I watched you," he said, his voice softer now. "Every day. I saw you carry the water. You did not cry. You did not complain. You did not stop. You carried the weight. You have a strong spirit." He looked up from her hand, his dark eyes meeting hers. "A strong spirit is a great prize, more valuable than many horses. Taza, her spirit is like a summer storm, loud and fierce, but it passes. Your spirit is like the mountain, it does not move." He let go of her hand and stood up. "You are not Inda," he said, using the Apache word for enemy. "You are Izan, the woman. My woman. My wife. You will learn our ways. Your spirit will strengthen our people." He turned and walked back towards the fire, leaving her in the darkness, her mind reeling. It was not an explanation that brought her comfort. It was not a declaration of love, or even affection. It was a statement of purpose. He had not taken her out of lust or cruelty. He had taken her because he saw something in her, a quality he valued, a strength he wanted to possess, to harness. She was not a person to him. She was a resource, a prize. The cage had just become infinitely more complex. It was no longer just a physical place. It was a kind of purpose, a gate of expectation. And for the first time, Emma began to wonder with a chilling sense of dread, what would happen if her spirit, the mountain he so admired, finally began to break. The seasons turned not with the gentle subtlety of the lands she'd once known, but with the stark, dramatic authority of the desert. The merciless sun of summer, which had baked the canyon walls to the color of dried blood, finally relented. A crisp, cool wind began to whisper down from the high mesas, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. The landscape, once a brutal canvas of reds and browns, softened. The cottonwood trees lining the hidden creek bed erupted into a blaze of brilliant, defiant gold, their leaves shimmering like 1,000 coins in the clear autumn light. And in the crucible of the Apache camp, Emma was changing. The transformation was not a decision she made, but a current that carried her. It was a slow, inexorable erosion of the woman she had been, the timid, grieving widow, and the gradual, painful accretion of something new, something harder, something forged in sun and silence. The woman who had measured her life in the weight of water buckets was learning to measure it in the turning of the stars and the migration of the hawks. Her body, once a vessel of exhaustion and sorrow, was becoming an instrument of survival. Her hands, which she had once tried to keep soft for a husband who was now dust, had toughened into leather, the palms calloused and capable. She could scrape a deer hide for hours without blistering her movements, economical and sure. She learned to weave watertight baskets from yucca fibers, her fingers remembering the ancient patterns whispered by one of the elder women. A crone named Lozan, who saw the mountain in Emma's spirit long before Nakai had given it a name. One afternoon, while gathering herbs with a group of women, she spotted a low-growing plant with feathery leaves and small white flowers. While the others passed it by, Emma paused. She had seen Nakai grind its roots into a poultice to treat a warrior's infected wound. Without thinking, she dug it from the hard soil, shaking the dirt from its roots. Lozan stopped and watched her, her face a mask of wrinkles. She nodded slowly, a single profound gesture of acknowledgement that sent a tremor of pride through Emma, a feeling so foreign it was almost painful. She learned the language. It seeped into her, not through lessons, but through the pores of her skin, through the constant living soundscape of the rancheria. The sharp clicking commands of the men returning from a hunt, the soft lilting lullabies of the mothers, the boisterous unfiltered chatter of the children. The sounds that had once been an alien barrier were now becoming a bridge. She began to dream in Apache. Her relationship with Nakai remained a vast, uncharted territory. He was the architect of her captivity, the silent center of her strange, new universe. He had not touched her again since that night by the fire. He had not claimed the rights of a husband. He still shared his sleeping mat with Taza, a nightly ritual that was both a relief and a strangely persistent ache in Emma's chest. Taza's open hatred had calcified into a sullen, watchful resentment. She could not break the white woman, and in a culture that revered strength, this failure was a constant public humiliation. Emma's quiet endurance had become its own form of power. Nakai's presence was a constant, a silent pressure at the edge of her consciousness. He provided for her with a detached but thorough efficiency. A new pair of moccasins would appear by her sleeping mat when her old ones wore thin. The choicest cut of meat from a kill would be placed on her plate. One evening, as she sat mending a tear in her buckskin dress, he returned from the high country and stopped before her. He opened his hand. On his palm lay a single perfect eagle feather, its white tip flawlessly barred with black. He laid it gently beside her and walked away without a word. Emma picked it up, her fingers trembling. It was not a gift of affection. It was a tribute to the spirit he had claimed as his own. She looked at his broad, scarred back as he settled by the fire, and the fear she had lived with for so long was crowded out by a new, terrifyingly complex emotion. She was bound to him not by force, but by his perception of her. He had seen a strength in her she hadn't known she possessed, and in seeing it, he had willed it into being. She was not happy. Happiness was a pale, flimsy word from another life. But she was present, vital. She would stand at the edge of the canyon as the sun set, watching the sky bleed into impossible shades of purple and orange, and feel a sense of awe so profound it bordered on prayer. This vast, wild, brutal land was becoming a part of her. The cage was becoming a sanctuary, and then the ghost of her past came riding into it. It began as a smudge of dust on the far horizon, a disturbance in the perfect silent landscape. The children saw it first, their play ceasing as they pointed with wide, solemn eyes. The camp grew still. The women stopped their work. The warriors materialized from the shadows, their hands finding their weapons. An atmosphere of placid routine instantly hardened into one of coiled, lethal readiness. The dust cloud resolved into riders. Blue uniforms. The jangle of sabers and bridles echoed unnervingly in the natural amphitheater of the canyon. The U.S. cavalry. They rode under a flag of truce, a flimsy piece of white cloth that seemed a mockery in this land of broken treaties. Leading the small detachment was a young, ambitious captain with a tidy moustache and an air of nervous importance. But it was the man beside him, the civilian scout in buckskins and a dusty hat, that made Emma's heart stop beating. John Carter. The name itself was a shock, a word from a forgotten language. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had courted her in the green, gentle hills of Missouri. He had been a farmer's son, smelling of clean earth and fresh hay, his promises of a comfortable life as solid and predictable as the turning of his father's fields. She had chosen Thomas's wild, uncertain dreams instead. Now, seeing John here, his handsome face tanned and hardened by the frontier, his eyes narrowed against the same sun that had baked her own skin, was like watching a spectre walk out of a grave. The Apaches gathered Nakai at the forefront. He did not posture or shout. He simply stood, his rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. His very stillness, a challenge, a bulwark of quiet authority. Emma shrank back into the shadows of the wickiup, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, her darker skin, her Apache dress, the way she now carried herself. It was a camouflage, a shield. She prayed it would be enough. The captain began to speak, his voice loud and unnatural in the canyon's silence. He spoke of peace, of government rations, of the Great White Father in Washington. He spoke of the San Carlos Reservation. The Apache faces remained like stone. And then John Carter's gaze began to sweep over the camp. It was a scout's gaze trained to see every detail, every anomaly. It passed over the wickiups, the drying racks, the faces of the warriors. And then it found her. For a moment, he simply stared. His brain could not process what his eyes were seeing. The woman in the shadows, clad in buckskin, her sun-bleached hair, braided like a squaw's. It was impossible. But it was her. He saw her eyes, those stormy, sea-green eyes that had haunted his dreams for 3 years. His face registered a flicker of disbelief, then confusion, then a dawning, sickening horror. Emma. The name was a choked whisper, lost in the wind, but she saw his lips form the word. He took an involuntary step forward, his hand half raised. The captain, irritated by the interruption, shot him a look and placed a restraining hand on his arm. It was too late. The ghost had a name. The connection had been made. The parley ended, as all such talks did, in a stalemate of mutual distrust. The captain, flustered by the Apache's stony silence, reiterated his empty promises and threats. Nakai listened, his face impassive, and then gave his answer, his voice cold and final. They would not go to San Carlos. This was their land. The discussion was over. The cavalry mounted their relief at leaving palpable. But John Carter lingered, his horse turning in a nervous circle, his eyes locked on the wickiup where Emma was hidden. He looked like a man who had seen an apparition and was now questioning his own sanity. The captain had to bark his name twice before he finally reluctantly tore his gaze away and followed his back, rigid with shock and a dawning, terrible resolve that Emma could feel even across the distance. The camp exploded into a low hum of activity, the warriors discussing the encounter in terse, angry bursts, the women gathering the children, their faces anxious. But Emma was trapped in her own private vortex of silence. John Carter knew. He thought she was a prisoner, a captive slave of the savages. He would be back. The thought was not a simple one. It was a complex, suffocating dread that split her soul in two. A part of her, the ghost of the Missouri girl, the widow Hayes, felt a wild, treacherous surge of hope. Rescue. The word itself was a temptation, a promise of soft beds and familiar food, of a world she understood. But what would she be returning to? The pitying glances of women like Martha Jacobson, the back-breaking loneliness, the life of hauling water, not for survival, but for mere existence. She was no longer that woman. The desert had burned that woman away. Here among these hard, violent people, she was not pitied. Her strength was valued. She was valued in a way she had never been before. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay on her thin blanket, listening to the soft breathing of Taza and Nakai on the other side of the wickiup. She thought of John with his kind, simple intentions and his civilized world that had no place for a woman like the one she was becoming. Then she thought of Nakai. The thought of him believing she had chosen to leave, that her spirit had broken and she had run back to the white world, sparked a feeling so sharp and painful it made her gasp. 2 nights later, the desert delivered her ghost. She was wrenched from a shallow, uneasy sleep by a hand clamped firmly over her mouth, cutting off her cry of alarm. Her eyes flew open to a dark figure leaning over her. For a terrifying split second, she thought a warrior from a rival band had slipped into the camp. Then the figure whispered, and the voice was a cataclysm from another world. "Shh, Emma, for God's sake, it's me, John Carter," hissed his voice, trembling with urgency. "Don't make a sound. I've come to get you out of here." He had come alone, a feat of such reckless bravery, she could hardly fathom it. He must have crept past the centuries a ghost in the moonlight, his love or his pity, a compass leading him through the darkness. "John," she breathed against his palm, her mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. "How?" Later he insisted, his grip on her arm tight and possessive. "There's no time. We have to go, now." before they wake up. He began to pull her, dragging her towards the entrance flap of the wickiup, but Emma's feet felt like they were rooted in the earth. She dug in her heels, her body resisting. She looked back at the sleeping forms across the small space, at Taza curled into a ball, and at Nakai, his powerful body relaxed in sleep, his proud, harsh face softened by the shadows. The man who had stolen her life, but who had also, in his own brutal way, given it back to her. The man who saw a mountain in her spirit. In that fatal moment of hesitation, the world fractured. Her foot scuffed against a loose stone. Outside, a camp dog, sensing an alien presence, let out a single sharp bark. And Nakai was awake. He didn't startle or shout. He rose in one fluid, silent motion, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the wickiup. He was on his feet, his knife in his hand, before Emma had drawn her next breath. He was not a man waking from sleep. He was a warrior answering a threat. John Carter spun around his own fear and desperation, making him clumsy. He ripped the pistol from his belt. "Stay back, savage," he warned, his voice cracking. Nakai didn't even seem to register the insult or the gun. His eyes, glittering in the darkness, were not on John. They were on Emma. They were fixed on John Carter's pale hand, gripping her arm like a manacle. And in Nakai's eyes, Emma saw something she had never seen before. Not the cold calculation of the leader, not the detached scrutiny of her captor, but a raw, primal fire. It was the look of a wolf seeing a rival's teeth on its mate. It was a fury that was deeply, terrifyingly personal. It was Taza who broke the spell. Her shrill scream of alarm tearing through the night, a clarion call that brought the entire camp to instant violent life. John panicked. Realizing escape with Emma was now impossible, he shoved her towards Nakai and fired his pistol. Not at Nakai, but at the roof of the wickiup, a desperate, foolish attempt to create chaos. But Nakai was not a creature of chaos. He was a creature of purpose. He moved with the impossible speed of a striking rattlesnake. He didn't lunge at John. He lunged for Emma, pulling her behind him, shielding her with his own body as warriors began to pour into the wickiup, their faces fierce in the moonlight, their knives and clubs ready. John was trapped, surrounded, a cornered animal, blinking in the sudden glare of his own mortality. He raised his pistol again, his knuckles white, preparing to sell his life dearly. No! The scream was torn from Emma's throat, a raw, ragged sound. Nakai barked a single sharp command in Apache. The warriors froze a circle of poised, lethal statues, waiting for the signal. Nakai turned slowly to face John Carter. The two men, the two worlds, stood in opposition, the fate of all three of them hanging in the balance. "She is not your woman," Nakai said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "She's not yours either." John spat back his terror, making him reckless. "Look at her. She's a white woman, a Christian. You stole her. You forced her into this life." Nakai's gaze flickered to Emma, and in the space of that single glance, he asked the question that held the weight of her entire existence. "Is he right? Are you a prisoner?" The world went silent. The crackle of the dying fire, the panting of the warriors, the wind in the canyon, it all faded away. There was only the circle of dark, watching faces. Taza was watching her expression, a complex mask of hatred and dawning, grudging respect. The other women were watching. The warriors, their hands tight on their weapons, were watching. And Nakai was watching. His dark eyes, held hers, demanding the truth. Her answer would be John Carter's death sentence or his pardon. It would be the final word on her own life. She looked at John, at his handsome, terrified face, a face from a life that no longer fit her, a life of soft comforts and quiet desperation, a life where she would always be the poor widow Hayes. Then she looked at Nakai, at his hard, scarred face, at the unyielding lines of his body, the man who had seen a mountain inside her when all she had felt was dust and ashes, the man who had given her a name that meant strength. She took a deep breath, the cold, clean air of the desert filling her lungs, clearing her mind. And she made her choice. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward. She moved out from behind the shelter of Nakai's body, away from John Carter's world, and stood beside her captor. She reached out her hand, her calloused, capable Apache hand, and placed it firmly on Nakai's arm. She looked John Carter directly in the eye, her own gaze clear and steady. Her voice, when she spoke, held no trace of the frightened woman he had once known. "You are wrong," she said, the words falling like stones into the silence. "I am not a prisoner." She turned her head, looking up at the harsh, beloved face of the warrior beside her, the man who was her husband. "I am home." The words hung in the cold night air, an impossible, irrefutable truth. John Carter stared, his face collapsing in on itself, with heartbreak and utter incomprehension. Nakai looked down at her hand on his arm, and for the first time in the depths of his dark warrior eyes, she saw the mountain reflected back at her. And it was not breaking. It was finally, immovably settled. Emma's choice was made. Not a choice between two men, but between two worlds, two versions of herself. She chose the mountain, the struggle, the spirit she never knew she had. Her story is a stark reminder that survival isn't just about breathing. It's about discovering what makes your heart beat. It's a testament to the fact that home is not always the place you were born, but the place you are forged. What happened next to Emma and Nakai in the face of the encroaching world? That's a story for another time. If this journey into the raw, untamed heart of the West moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who appreciates real drama, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more tales from the frontier that history books are afraid to tell. Your support allows us to keep these stories alive. Thank you for watching.